The galaxy was full of wonders. There were worlds made entirely of crystal that sang when solar winds touched them. There were civilizations so old that they had forgotten more knowledge than young species would ever learn. There were trade routes connecting 1,000,000 planets and space stations larger than moons. The Concord of United Species governed over 2,000 different civilizations and kept peace across distances that would take light itself thousands of years to cross. But there was one place where no ship traveled, one region of space that appeared on every star chart with a single warning symbol, a sphere of emptiness roughly 4,000 light years across. The maps called it many things depending on which species had drawn them. The boundary, the silence, the forbidden zone, but the meaning was always the same. Do not enter. Do not approach. Do not ask why. Cirrus was young by the standards of her people, the Voltheri. She had lived only 300 years and had spent most of that time studying history. Her scales were the pale blue of a scholar who rarely saw natural sunlight, and her 4 eyes were often tired from reading ancient texts. She had been assigned to the Galactic Archive on Nexus Prime, the great station world at the heart of the Concord. Her task was simple but important. The Concord would soon celebrate its 50,000th year of existence. Cirrus was to compile a complete history of how it began. She started her work with enthusiasm. The archive contained records from every member species, millions of documents and recordings and memory crystals stretching back to before most civilizations had discovered fire. She spent her first month simply learning how to navigate the collection. By her second month, she had begun to notice something strange. Every species had gaps in their history. This was normal. Records were lost to wars and disasters and simple neglect. But these gaps were different. They all occurred at the same time, roughly 10,000 years ago. And they all related to the same subject, the boundary. Cirrus found thousands of references to the Forbidden Zone. Ancient warnings passed down through generations. Laws prohibiting travel in that direction. Educational materials teaching young members of every species that some regions of space were simply not to be explored. But nowhere could she find an explanation of why. The warnings existed. The prohibition was absolute. But the reason had been erased. She began interviewing the elder scholars who maintained the archive. The first was a Dranathi named Voss, a being whose species possessed perfect genetic memory stretching back millions of years. If anyone knew the truth, surely it would be the Dranathi. Voss received her in a small reading chamber deep in the archive's oldest section. He was ancient even by Dranathi standards, his crystalline body clouded with age, his movements slow and careful. Cirrus asked him about the boundary, about what lay beyond it, about why every species in the galaxy seemed to share the same fear of a region that none of them could remember. The old scholar was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was like wind through broken glass. "We purged it," he said. "My people. We deliberately removed that period from our genetic memory." Cirrus did not understand. The Dranathi considered their perfect memory to be sacred. It was the foundation of their entire civilization. To deliberately erase any part of it would be unthinkable. Such an act would require the unanimous consent of every living Dranathi, Voss continued. It has never happened before or since. The vote was held 10,000 years ago. Every single member of our species agreed. Whatever we saw, whatever we learned, we decided together that it must be forgotten. He would say nothing more. Cirrus left the reading chamber with more questions than answers. She interviewed dozens of other scholars over the following weeks. The Karathi, whose hive minds spanned entire worlds. The Neth, who existed partially outside of normal time. The Vrul, whose silicon-based biology gave them lifespans measured in geological ages. Each had the same story to tell. Their ancestors had known something about the boundary. That knowledge had been deliberately erased. The prohibition remained, even though the reason for it had been forgotten. Some spoke of ancestral shame. A Karathi hive speaker described a deep unease that had been passed down through thousands of generations, a sense of collective guilt that none of them could explain. A Neth observer mentioned dreams that their people still experienced, visions of something vast and patient waiting in the darkness, something that had seen them completely and found them wanting. But no one could tell her what actually lay beyond the boundary. No one could explain what the humans were or what they had done. Humans. That was the word that kept appearing in the oldest references. A species called humans living on a world called Earth somewhere in the Forbidden Zone. But there were no detailed records of them. No descriptions of their appearance or culture or technology. Just the name and the warning that accompanied it. Do not approach. Do not contact. Do not remember. Cirrus became obsessed. She spent her nights searching through the archive's oldest and most restricted sections. She filed requests for access to sealed records that had not been opened in millennia. Most of her requests were denied without explanation. But finally, after months of petitioning, she was granted access to a vault that required the highest security clearance in the Concord. The vault was small and cold. It contained only one object, a data crystal so old that it had begun to decay at the molecular level. The archivists warned her that it might be unreadable. But when she activated it, a recording began to play. It was a warning beacon's automated message. The timestamp showed that it had been transmitted exactly 10,000 years ago, from a ship that had been approaching the boundary. The voice was Velthary, speaking in a dialect so ancient that Cirrus could barely understand it. But the meaning was clear. This is the exploration vessel Bright Dawn. We have made contact. They showed us what we are. We cannot face them again. Let no one follow. The shame is too great. The truth is too terrible. They did not harm us. That is the worst part. They simply showed us ourselves. Let this message serve as final warning. The boundary must never be crossed. We are not ready. We may never be ready. The message ended. Cirrus sat in the cold vault for a long time, trying to understand what she had heard. The humans had shown the Bright Dawn's crew something about themselves. Something so terrible that it had led to the greatest act of collective forgetting in galactic history. She was still thinking about this when she received an urgent summons to the Concord's Emergency Council. She was not a member of the council, but her research had apparently attracted attention at the highest levels. When she arrived at the Great Chamber, where the representatives of 2,000 species gathered to debate matters of galactic importance, she found it in chaos. The council was arguing. Representatives from hundreds of species were speaking over each other, their translators struggling to keep up with the flood of different languages. Cirrus found a place at the edge of the chamber and tried to understand what was happening. It seemed that a rogue exploration consortium, frustrated by the Concord's economic stagnation and hungry for new resources, had secretly launched a probe toward the Forbidden Zone. The consortium had believed that the prohibition was nothing but superstition, a relic of a more fearful age. They had decided to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. The probe would cross the boundary in 3 days. Cirrus watched as the council descended into panic. Representatives demanded that the probe be recalled, but the consortium had designed it to be autonomous, beyond remote control. Others suggested sending a fast ship to intercept it, but the probe was already too deep in the buffer zone for any vessel to catch it in time. Some argued that perhaps nothing would happen. Perhaps the boundary was indeed just superstition. Perhaps the humans were long dead or had evolved beyond caring about physical intrusions. But no one really believed this. Cirrus could see the fear in every face, hear it in every voice. These were the leaders of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. They commanded fleets that could shatter worlds. They controlled technologies that bent the laws of physics to their will. And they were terrified of something that none of them could remember. An elderly representative from the Kethrani, a species known for their long memories and cautious wisdom, called for silence. When the chamber finally quieted, he spoke in a voice heavy with age. "We do not remember what lies beyond the boundary," he said. "But our fear remembers. Our shame remembers. For 10,000 years, every species in this chamber has passed down the same warning to their children. Do not cross. Do not approach. Do not remember. We do not know why we are afraid, but we are afraid nonetheless. And now we must face whatever it was that our ancestors could not face." The chamber erupted again. But Cirrus was no longer listening. She was thinking about the message from the bright dawn, about the crew who had made contact with humans and returned, broken by what they had learned, about the deliberate forgetting that had erased 10,000 years of history. What could possibly be so terrible that the entire galaxy had chosen to forget it? What had the humans shown them? And what would happen when the probe crossed the boundary and reminded everyone of what they had tried so hard to forget? She did not have to wait long to find out. The emergency session continued through the night and end. The emergency council had been in session for 2 days. Food and water were brought in by servants who moved quietly along the edges of the great chamber. Representatives slept in shifts, their places held by junior diplomats who looked as exhausted as their seniors. The arguments had grown repetitive. Everyone agreed that something had to be done. No one could agree on what. Cirrus had found a corner where she could observe without being noticed. She had no official role in the council, but no one had asked her to leave. Perhaps they had forgotten she was there. Perhaps they simply had more pressing concerns than one young historian asking uncomfortable questions. The probe was now less than 12 hours from crossing the boundary. The morning session began with yet another round of proposals. A rule scientist suggested deploying an energy field that might disable the probe before it reached the forbidden zone. The mathematics were presented, debated, and ultimately rejected. There was not enough time. A Karathi hive speaker offered to send a desperate plea into the void, begging forgiveness from whatever might be listening. This too was rejected. No one knew if the humans would receive such a message or how they might respond to it. As the hours passed, Cirrus noticed a new presence in the chamber. An ancient being had entered through a door that she had not seen open. It moved slowly, its form difficult to describe. It was not quite solid, not quite energy, something in between that seemed to shift and flow like liquid light. The representatives fell silent as it approached the central speaking platform. Even the most powerful among them showed respect that bordered on reverence. Cirrus did not recognize the being's species. She consulted her research device and found only a single entry, the remnant. Last surviving member of the Vorithani. Approximate age, 17 million years. 17 million years. This creature had been alive when most of the species in this chamber were still single-celled organisms floating in primordial oceans. It had witnessed the rise and fall of empires that left no other trace in the historical record. If anyone knew the truth about the boundary, it would be the remnant. The ancient being settled onto the speaking platform. Its voice, when it spoke, seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You are frightened," it said. "I can taste your fear. It is old fear. Inherited fear. Your ancestors planted it in your genes so deep that you cannot remove it even after 10,000 years of forgetting. You do not know why you are afraid. You only know that you are." No one contradicted it. "I will tell you what your ancestors knew," the remnant continued. "I will tell you about the humans and what they did to the Dominion. Perhaps this knowledge will help you face what is coming. Perhaps it will only make your fear worse. But you have chosen to remember, and so you shall. The chamber grew even quieter. Cirrus leaned forward, her 4 eyes fixed on the ancient being. 10,000 years ago, the galaxy was a different place. There was no concord. There was only the Dominion. Hundreds of species bound together by conquest and fear. The strong ruled the weak. The powerful took what they wanted. Those who resisted were destroyed. Those who submitted were enslaved. This was the natural order of things, or so the Dominion believed. The remnant paused. Some of the representatives shifted uncomfortably. Cirrus knew that many of their species had been part of the Dominion. The shame that their ancestors had passed down was beginning to make sense. The Dominion had ruled for 3 million years. They had conquered every species they had ever encountered. They had never met an enemy they could not defeat. And so when their scouts discovered a small blue world near the galaxy's edge, a world populated by a young species that had barely learned to leave their own atmosphere, they expected no resistance. They assembled a subjugation fleet of 50,000 warships and sent it to claim their newest conquest. 50,000 warships. Cirrus tried to imagine such a force. Even the modern Concord, with all its resources, could not field more than a fraction of that number. The humans were primitive by galactic standards. Their technology was barely capable of reaching their own moon. Their weapons were laughable. Their defenses were non-existent. By every measure, they should have surrendered immediately. They should have recognized the hopelessness of their situation and submitted to Dominion rule as so many species had before them. The remnant's form flickered slightly. If Cirrus had to guess, she would have said it was displaying something like distress. Instead, they requested a single day to prepare their response. A murmur ran through the chamber. Even knowing that something extraordinary had happened, the representatives seemed surprised by this detail. A primitive species asking an overwhelming invasion force to wait? It was absurd. It was suicidal. It was something else entirely. The Dominion commanders were amused by this request. They granted it. They assumed the humans were using the time to prepare their surrender, perhaps to organize their population for efficient enslavement. They spent the day drinking and celebrating their easy victory. They made jokes about how quickly this new species had broken. The remnant's voice grew heavier. When the day ended, the subjugation fleet vanished. Cirrus felt a chill run through her scales. Vanished, not destroyed. Not fled, simply gone. Every ship, every crew member, every weapon, 50,000 warships carrying millions of soldiers disappeared from existence without any warning or explanation. In their place appeared a single human vessel, small and unassuming. It carried one passenger, a human diplomat who requested a meeting with the Dominion's leadership. The chamber had grown so quiet that Cirrus could hear her own hearts beating. The Dominion was terrified. They had never encountered anything like this. They assembled their greatest leaders, their most powerful warlords, the beings who had conquered galaxies and crushed civilizations without mercy. They gathered in their most secure facility, surrounded by every defensive measure their technology could provide. And they waited for the human diplomat to arrive. The remnant paused again. When it continued, its voice was barely above a whisper. I was there. I was young then, only 2 million years old, but I had earned a place among the Dominion's advisors. I witnessed what happened next, and I have spent the last 10,000 years wishing that I had not. Cirrus held her breath. The human diplomat did not threaten us, did not make demands, did not conquer. She simply asked if we were ready to see the truth about ourselves. The warlords laughed at her. They were still confident despite the loss of the fleet. They believed that whatever trick the humans had used could be countered. They believed that their power was still supreme. The remnant's form flickered more violently. Then she showed us. The silence in the chamber was absolute. I cannot describe what we saw. The words do not exist in any language. But I can tell you what it felt like. Imagine every wrong thing you have ever done. Every cruelty. Every betrayal. Every moment when you chose your own comfort over another being's suffering. Now multiply that by 1,000,000 lives. By 1,000,000,000. By all the lives that your species has ever affected through all the years of its existence. Imagine seeing the complete weight of your civilization's moral history. Every atrocity and exploitation laid bare. Every victim remembered. Every justification stripped away. Some of the representatives were trembling. Others had closed their eyes as if trying to block out the remnant's words. That is what the humans showed us. The moral resonance of our actions made visible. The accumulated suffering we had caused echoing through time. The Dominion had conquered thousands of species. We had enslaved billions of beings. We had destroyed worlds for profit and exterminated entire civilizations for convenience. And in that moment, we saw all of it. We felt all of it. We understood, finally, what we had truly done. The remnant's voice broke slightly. The warlords who had ruled the galaxy for 3,000,000 years returned from that meeting weeping. These were beings who had committed genocide without remorse. They had ordered the deaths of billions without losing sleep. But they could not face the truth about themselves. They could not look at what they had become. Cirrus finally understood. The fear, the shame, the deliberate forgetting. It all made sense now. Within a year, the Dominion dissolved itself. Every species that had been part of it agreed to forget what had happened. The humans simply withdrew behind their boundary and asked only one thing, that no one follow. They did not punish us. They did not enslave us. They did not take revenge for the invasion we had attempted. They simply showed us ourselves and let us choose what to do with that knowledge. The remnant fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a young representative from the Kethrani, a species that had suffered terribly under Dominion rule, stood up. Her voice was shaking. Why? Why did they show mercy to monsters? Why did they give you a chance to change when you had given none to your victims? The remnant turned toward her. Its ancient form seemed to grow smaller, humbler. I asked the human diplomat that same question. She looked at me with eyes that had seen the weight of every soul in the galaxy, and she said something I have never forgotten. The chamber waited. She said, because we almost became the same thing. Because we looked into our own darkness and chose D. The countdown had reached 0. The probe had crossed the boundary 30 minutes ago, and nothing had happened. The council chamber remained tense, every representative watching their monitoring devices for any sign of response from the Forbidden Zone. But the screens showed only empty space. The probe continued its journey deeper into human territory, transmitting data about unremarkable star systems and ordinary planetary formations. Some of the younger representatives began to relax. Perhaps the remnant story had been exaggerated. Perhaps the humans had died out during the 10,000 years of isolation. Perhaps they had evolved beyond caring about physical intrusions into their space. The galaxy had changed enormously since the fall of the Dominion. Why should the humans have remained the same? Cirrus did not share this optimism. She had read the Bright Dawn's final message. She had seen the fear in the remnant's ancient form. Whatever the humans were, they were not the type to simply disappear. Her instincts proved correct exactly 47 minutes after the probe crossed the boundary. It began with the telemetry. The probe's instruments suddenly stopped transmitting data about its surroundings. Instead, they began receiving information from an external source. The probe's cameras, which should have been pointed at distant stars, turned as if guided by an invisible hand. They focused on a point in empty space where nothing visible existed. Then the point began to glow. A shape emerged from the glow. It was a vessel of some kind, but unlike anything in the Concorde's databases. Its hull seemed to be made of folded light, constantly shifting between states that the probe's sensors could not identify. It was small, no larger than a personal transport, but the energy readings coming from it exceeded anything the Concorde had ever recorded from a single ship. The human vessel did not communicate with the probe. It did not attempt to destroy it or disable it. It simply hung in space beside it, as if waiting. The waiting did not last long. Every screen on Nexus Prime activated simultaneously. Every communication device across the entire Concorde carried the same signal. Cirrus watched as the displays in the council chamber flickered and then showed a single image, a human face. She had never seen a human before. The archives contained no visual records of them, but somehow she recognized the species immediately. There was something about the eyes, something that seemed to see not just what was in front of them, but everything behind it as well. The face belonged to an older female with gray hair and features marked by age. Despite this, there was no sense of frailty about her. She radiated a calm authority that made the most powerful beings in the chamber seem small. "Greetings to the Concorde of United Species," the human said. Her voice was gentle, almost warm. "I am the keeper of the threshold. I apologize for the unexpected nature of this contact. Your ancestors and mine agreed that the boundary would remain closed until certain conditions were met. The arrival of your probe has complicated that arrangement somewhat." The chamber remained frozen in silence. No one seemed to know how to respond. After 10,000 years of prohibition and fear, actual communication with humans was beyond anything they had prepared for. The Keeper continued as if she had expected this reaction. "First, let me assure you that the probe will be returned unharmed. We understand that its launch was not sanctioned by your central government. We do not hold the Concorde responsible for the actions of a rogue consortium. The crew members who authorized this mission will face whatever justice you deem appropriate under your own laws. We have no interest in punishment." A collective breath seemed to pass through the chamber. At least there would be no immediate consequences for the violation. "Second, I should explain who I am and what my role entails. Humanity established the threshold 10,000 years ago as a period of separation. We had seen the state of galactic civilization and found it deeply troubling. We had been forced to reveal certain truths to your ancestors that were difficult for them to accept. Rather than impose our judgment on species that were not ready to hear it, we chose to withdraw and allow the galaxy to find its own path." The Keeper's expression shifted slightly. Something that might have been hope flickered across her ancient features. "My role has been to watch. For 10,000 years, I and others like me have observed your development from beyond the boundary. We have witnessed your wars and your peace agreements. We have seen your failures and your triumphs. We have watched the Concorde form from the ashes of the Dominion and slowly, imperfectly, begin to build something better than what came before." Cirrus felt a chill run through her. The humans had been watching all along. Every action the galaxy had taken, every choice every species had made, had been observed and judged by the beings behind the boundary. "I am pleased to tell you that what we have seen gives us hope." The tension in the chamber shifted. Representatives who had been rigid with fear began to show confusion instead. They had expected judgment. They had expected condemnation. They had not expected hope. "The prohibition was never meant to be eternal," the Keeper continued. "It was a period of reflection, both for humanity and for those who once sought to conquer us. Your ancestors committed terrible crimes. They caused suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. But they were not evil in any cosmic sense. They were merely young. They had not yet learned the weight of their choices or the responsibility that comes with power. We gave them time to learn these things. And we gave ourselves time to decide whether mercy had been the right choice. The keeper paused, and for a moment her composure seemed to waver. Cirrus could not be certain, but she thought she saw tears forming in the human's eyes. We have decided. The galaxy has earned the right to know the truth. Not because you have become perfect. No civilization ever does. But because you have become better. The descendants of the Dominion have built something their ancestors could not have imagined. Trade instead of conquest. Cooperation instead of exploitation. Protection for the weak instead of endless predation. These changes did not happen by accident. They happened because billions of beings across thousands of years chose to be something other than what their ancestors were. A low murmur spread through the chamber. Cirrus saw representatives looking at each other with expressions of wonder and uncertainty. They had spent 10,000 years carrying inherited shame for crimes they did not commit. Now they were being told that their redemption was being recognized. "I am authorized to offer you a choice," the keeper said. "The probe can be returned and the boundary maintained. You can continue as you have been, separate from humanity, the past forgotten. Many of your people would prefer this, I suspect. The truth is not always comfortable." She paused again. "Or you can choose to learn what really happened 10,000 years ago. You can understand why your ancestors chose to forget. And you can begin the process of integrating humanity back into the galactic community. This will require courage. It will force you to confront things about your history that will be painful to accept. But it will also open possibilities that have been close to you for 100 centuries." The keeper fell silent, waiting for a response. The council erupted into debate. Representatives argued passionately on both sides. Some demanded that the boundary be maintained forever. They had built stable societies on the foundation of forgetting. Why risk everything by remembering now? Others insisted that the truth must be known. How could the Concord claim to value knowledge and progress while deliberately hiding from its own history? The debate lasted for hours. Cirrus watched as species that had once been part of the Dominion argued with species that had been its victims. Old divisions threatened to resurface. But gradually, the mood in the chamber shifted. The keeper had said that the galaxy had earned the right to know. That recognition meant something. It suggested that whatever the truth was, the modern Concord was capable of handling it. Finally, a vote was called. The result was nearly unanimous. The Concord chose to learn the truth. Only the eldest species abstained. The remnant had already left the chamber, but others of comparable age simply sat in silence as the vote was counted. They alone remembered what it had felt like to face the human's judgment directly. They knew what was coming. The keeper received the result with a nod that seemed both satisfied and sorrowful. "Very well. I will show you what we showed your ancestors. But first, you must understand something about humanity. When we were young, we discovered something that changed everything we believed about the nature of reality. We learned to perceive what we call moral resonance. The fabric of existence itself carries the imprint of every sentient choice ever made. Kindness leaves one pattern. Cruelty leaves another. We learned to see these patterns as clearly as you see light and shadow." She let this sink in. "When the Dominion's fleet arrived at our world, we looked at our would-be conquerors and saw the accumulated weight of every atrocity their civilizations had ever committed. Millions of years of suffering, exploitation, and moral failure, visible to us as plainly as their warships. We saw what they were, and then we gave them a choice." Cirrus held her breath along with everyone else in the chamber. "We did not destroy the fleet," the keeper said softly. "We showed them what we saw. We showed them themselves. And then we let them decide what to do with that knoll. The vision lasted only minutes, but it felt like centuries. Cirrus experienced it along with every other being in the council chamber. She felt the perspective of a Dominion warlord standing before the human diplomat 10,000 years ago. She saw what he saw. She felt what he felt. The human had seemed so small, so fragile. She stood barely taller than a child of most species, her body soft and weak by any galactic standard. The warlord had looked at her and seen prey. He had ruled an empire spanning 1,000 star systems. He had commanded the deaths of billions. He had never met a being he could not break. Then she had asked if he was ready to see the truth. He had laughed. Of course he was ready. What could this primitive creature possibly show him that would change anything? He was powerful beyond measure. He was feared across the galaxy. He was the master of all he surveyed. The human diplomat had simply looked at him. And then the vision began. Cirrus felt it crash over her like a wave. Every slave the warlord had ever taken. Every world he had ordered burned. Every child left orphaned by his conquests. Every life cut short for his profit or his pleasure. She felt each one individually, not as abstract numbers, but as real beings with hopes and fears and loves of their own. She felt their suffering as if it were her own. She experienced their deaths as if she were dying herself. And then she felt the accumulated weight of all of them together. It was crushing. It was impossible. It was the moral resonance that the Keeper had described, the pattern left by millions of years of cruelty and exploitation made visible to the senses. The warlord had stood before it and understood for the first time what he truly was. Not a great conqueror, not a powerful ruler, just a being who had caused an ocean of suffering for the sake of his own ambition. The vision shifted. Cirrus saw other Dominion leaders experiencing the same revelation. She watched as the most fearsome beings in galactic history collapsed under the weight of their own history. Some screamed. Some wept. Some simply stood in silence as the truth destroyed every lie they had ever told themselves about who they were and what they had done. And through it all, the human diplomat simply watched. She did not gloat. She did not condemn. She did not threaten or demand. She simply let them see themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time in their entire lives. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun. Cirrus found herself back in the council chamber, gasping for breath, her 4 eyes streaming with tears. Around her, representatives of 2,000 species were in similar states of shock. Some had fallen from their seats. Others were holding each other, seeking comfort from beings they had never spoken to before. The Keeper's face reappeared on the screens. She looked tired, as if sharing the vision had cost her something. "Now you understand," she said quietly. "Now you know what your ancestors saw. And now you know why they chose to forget." A Kethrani representative stood on shaking legs. Her species had been among the Dominion's most brutalized victims. Billions of her people had been enslaved and killed over the centuries of Dominion rule. "Why?" she demanded. "Why did you show them mercy? They deserve destruction. They deserve to suffer as they made others suffer. Why did you give them a chance to change?" The Keeper's expression softened with something that looked like compassion. Because destruction would have solved nothing. The suffering they caused would not have been undone by adding more suffering. The dead would not have been brought back by creating more dead. And because we understood something that your ancestors did not yet know. She paused, seeming to gather her strength. Humanity almost became the same thing. In our early history, we committed atrocities against each other that rivaled anything the Dominion ever did. We enslaved our own kind. We conquered and exploited and destroyed. We came within a single generation of wiping ourselves out through hatred and tribalism and short-sighted greed. Cirrus saw a shock ripple through the chamber. The terrifying beings behind the boundary, the species that had humbled the Dominion without firing a shot, had once been as flawed as anyone else. The difference was not that we were better than your ancestors, the Keeper continued. The difference was that we faced a moment of choice. We looked honestly at what we were becoming, and we decided to be something else. It was not easy. It took generations of struggle and failure and painful growth. But we made that choice, and we kept making it, until we became the species we are today. She looked directly at the Kethrani representative. We could not deny others the same opportunity. We could not judge your ancestors for being where we had once been. So we showed them the truth about themselves and let them decide. We gave them the same choice we had given ourselves. And then we withdrew to see what they would choose. The representative sat down slowly, her expression troubled. But they chose to forget, someone called out. They chose to erase the truth rather than face it. The Keeper nodded. Yes, and that was their right. We did not force them to remember. We did not demand immediate transformation. We simply offered them the chance to change and trusted that, over time, that chance might bear fruit. She gestured, and the screen showed a new visualization. It was the galaxy as the humans perceived it, a vast tapestry of light and shadow representing the moral resonance of 10,000 years of choices. This is what we have watched since the boundary was established. This is the pattern of your civilization's moral development. Cirrus stared at the image. She could see the old darkness of the Dominion era, a deep stain underlying everything else. It had faded over the millennia, but it was still visible, a reminder of what had come before. But layered over it were countless threads of light. Each one represented an act of kindness, a moment of cooperation, a choice to help rather than harm. Your ancestors carried inherited shame, but their descendants did not simply wallow in it. The Concord emerged from the Dominion's ashes and chose a different path. Trade instead of conquest. Cooperation instead of exploitation. Protection for the vulnerable instead of endless predation. The Keeper's voice grew warmer. We have watched species that once slaughtered each other learn to share worlds peacefully. We have seen victims and oppressors come together to build institutions that serve all equally. We have observed generation after generation choosing, imperfectly but genuinely, to be better than those who came before. She smiled. And for the first time since the contact began, there was no sorrow in her expression. The Concord is not perfect. No civilization ever is. But the trajectory is unmistakable. The galaxy is growing toward light. And that growth is not because we forced it. It is because your people chose it. Every act of kindness, every moment of mercy, every decision to help rather than harm was freely made by beings who could have chosen otherwise. Cirrus felt something shifting in the chamber. The shame that had hung over every representative was beginning to transform into something else. Not pride, exactly. More like recognition. Their ancestors had committed terrible crimes, but they themselves had spent their lives building something better. That had to count for something. The question the remnant asked you was whether you used the last 10,000 years well, the Keeper said. I am here to answer that question on behalf of humanity. The chamber held its breath. You did, not perfectly, not without setbacks and failures and moments of regression. But on the whole, across the span of 100 centuries, the galaxy has become a better place than it was when we withdrew. The moral resonance of your civilization has shifted fundamentally toward light. The Keeper bowed her head. 10,000 years ago, we offered your ancestors mercy because we believed in the capacity for change. Today, we tell you that our faith was not misplaced. You have earned the right to know the truth about your past, and you have earned the right to help shape the future. She raised her head again. But there is one more thing you must understand. The boundary will be lifted. Humanity will rejoin the galactic community. And when we do, we will bring with us a gift that will change everything. Cirrus leaned forward, her heart's pounding. We will teach you to see as we see. We will share the ability to perceive moral resonance directly, to understand the weight of your choices as clearly as you understand the physical world. This is not a punishment. It is an invitation to continue the growth you have already begun, but with new tools to guide you. The chamber erupted into a chaos of reactions. Some representatives looked terrified at the prospect of having their every moral failure made visible. Others seemed eager, recognizing that transparency could accelerate the ethical progress they had been struggling toward for millennia. Cirrus alone sat in contemplative silence. She finally understood what the title of her historical compilation must be. Not a celebration of political achievements, not a chronicle of treaties and trade agreements, but a record of moral evolution. The story of how civilizations that once committed genocide and enslavement chose, generation by generation, to become something better, and how that choice was made possible by an enemy who refused to be an enemy. 3 months had passed since the Keeper's transmission. The galaxy had not stopped talking about it. The Concord's governing bodies had been in continuous session, debating the implications of everything they had learned. Some species demanded more time to prepare before the boundary was lifted. Others pushed for immediate integration. Old alliances fractured and new ones formed as the political landscape shifted in response to the revelations about the past. But gradually, a consensus emerged. The boundary would be lifted. Humanity would be welcomed back into the galactic community, and the gift of moral perception would be accepted, though with safeguards and training protocols that would take years to implement fully. Cirrus had been promoted. Her research into the boundary had made her one of the leading experts on human history, and she had been appointed to the integration committee that would oversee the transition. Her first major task was to help organize the formal ceremony that would mark humanity's return to galactic affairs. The ceremony was held on Nexus Prime, in the great assembly hall that could accommodate representatives from every Concord species. Cirrus stood near the front of the gathered crowd, watching as the human delegation arrived. She had expected something grand. Perhaps a fleet of the impossible vessels she had seen in the probe's footage. Perhaps beings of terrifying power and cosmic authority come to remake the galaxy in their image. Instead, 5 ordinary-looking humans walked through the assembly doors. They were dressed simply, in clothes that would not have looked out of place on any developed world. They smiled as they entered, nodding to the representatives they passed, pausing to greet those who stepped forward to meet them. They seemed genuinely pleased to be there, like travelers returning home after a long journey. The leader of the delegation was a man who introduced himself simply as Marcus. He had gray hair and laugh lines around his eyes. His handshake, when Cirrus received it, was warm and firm. "You're the historian," he said. "The one who wouldn't stop asking questions about the boundary. I've read some of your work. It's good, honest, that's rare." Cirrus did not know how to respond. This was a being whose species could perceive the moral weight of every soul in the galaxy, who possessed technology beyond anything the Concord could imagine, who had shown mercy to monsters and then waited 10,000 years to see if that mercy was justified. And he was complimenting her research. "I didn't understand," she said finally. "Not until the Keeper showed us. I spent months trying to figure out why everyone was so afraid, and I never imagined anything like the truth." Marcus nodded. "The truth is usually stranger than our fears. That's something we've learned over the years. What we imagine in the darkness is rarely as complex or as hopeful as what actually exists." The ceremony began. There were speeches and proclamations and symbolic gestures of unity. Representatives from species that had once been part of the Dominion stood beside representatives of species their ancestors had brutalized, all of them together, welcoming the beings who had ended the old order without violence. The Keeper was present as well, though she stood apart from the main delegation. Cirrus noticed that she spent most of the ceremony watching the crowd rather than the proceedings, her ancient eyes moving from face to face as if reading something invisible. When the formal program ended, the assembly dissolved into smaller conversations. Diplomats clustered around the human delegates, eager to establish relationships that would shape the coming decades. Cirrus found herself on the edge of these groups, observing rather than participating. Marcus noticed her watching and broke away from a circle of admirers to join her. "You have questions," he said. It was not really a question. "Too many," Cirrus admitted. "But one keeps coming back to me. The Keeper said you would teach us to perceive moral resonance. What will that mean? What will it feel like to see the galaxy as you see it?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "It will be difficult at first. Your species, like most, have developed the ability to ignore certain uncomfortable truths. You can know intellectually that your actions cause harm to others, but that knowledge is usually abstract, distant, easy to set aside. Moral perception makes that impossible. You see the effects of your choices as clearly as you see physical objects. You cannot pretend that suffering does not exist when it is visible right in front of you." He paused. "But it also makes joy visible. Kindness leaves its mark as surely as cruelty. Every time you help someone, every time you choose connection over isolation, every time you set aside your own comfort for the sake of another, that choice creates patterns of light that are beautiful beyond description. The galaxy is not only darkness, it is also full of more goodness than most beings realize." Cirrus thought about this. "That sounds overwhelming." "It is. But it is also clarifying. When you can see the true weight of your choices, making those choices becomes simpler. Not easier, necessarily, but clearer. You no longer have to wonder whether your actions matter. You can see that they do." They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the crowd. "What haunted our ancestors wasn't just a vision of their crimes," Cirrus said slowly. "It was the mercy. They couldn't understand why you didn't destroy them, why you gave them a chance they knew they didn't deserve." Marcus nodded. "That's often the hardest thing to accept. Not judgment, but forgiveness. Judgment makes sense to beings who have done terrible things. They expect punishment because they know they deserve it. But grace is confusing. It doesn't fit into the moral frameworks they've built for themselves. You gave them a gift they couldn't receive. We gave them a gift that would take 10,000 years to unwrap. And now, finally, the galaxy is ready to understand what was given." Cirrus looked at him directly. "Are we? Ready, I mean." "Truly," Marcus smiled. It was a kind smile, but there was something sad in it as well. No civilization is ever truly ready for transformation. Growth is always uncomfortable. But you have demonstrated something that the Dominion never could. You have demonstrated the willingness to change. Not because you were forced to, but because you chose to. That willingness is all that has ever mattered." The ceremony wound down as the day progressed. Representatives returned to their vessels and their homeworlds, carrying news of the historic occasion. The human delegates remained on Nexus Prime, beginning the long process of establishing permanent diplomatic relations. Cirrus returned to her quarters in the archive as the station's artificial night cycle began. She sat at her research terminal, staring at the blank document that would eventually become her historical compilation. She had been assigned to write the story of the Concorde's 50,000 years. But now she understood that the real story was much older and much stranger than anyone had realized. She began to type. For 10,000 years, no one crossed into human space. The prohibition was absolute. The fear was universal. Every species in the known galaxy inherited the same warning from their ancestors. Do not approach. Do not contact. Do not remember. But no one could explain why. She paused, considering her next words. This is the story of how we finally remembered. It is the story of crimes and mercy, of shame and redemption, of beings who were given a chance they did not deserve and slowly, imperfectly, learned to become worthy of it. It is not a comfortable story. The truth rarely is. But it is a hopeful one. Outside her window, the stars wheeled in their endless dance. Somewhere among them, beyond where the boundary had once stood, humanity was emerging from its long isolation. They would bring gifts and challenges in equal measure. They would change everything about how the galaxy understood itself. But they would not come as conquerors. They would come as teachers. And perhaps as friends. Cirrus smiled and continued to write. The memory still haunts us. But we are beginning to understand that what haunts us is not fear of human power. It is the unbearable weight of having been truly seen. Every flaw, every failure, every cruelty laid bare, and then forgiven anyway. For 10,000 years, we could not face that grace. It was easier to forget than to accept that we had been loved despite everything we were. She typed the final line of her introduction. Now we are ready to remember. Now we are ready to be haunted no longer. The words glowed on the screen, the beginning of a story that would take years to complete. But Cirrus knew now how it would end. Not with conquest or submission. Not with the strong dominating the weak. But with beings of different species and different histories coming together to build something their ancestors could not have imagined. The humans had waited 10,000 years for this moment. They had believed, against all evidence, that mercy could transform even the worst of enemies into something better. And they had been right. That was the true inheritance of the boundary. Not fear, not shame, not the memory of crimes long past, but the possibility of redemption. The proof that civilizations could change. The demonstration that even the darkest history could become the foundation for a brighter future. Cirrus saved her work and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the first human vessels were crossing into Concord space, coming home to a galaxy that had finally learned to welcome them. She thought of the Keeper's words. They had earned the right to know the truth. They had earned the right to shape the future.